Chapter 17, Elections and Voting. Our chapter objectives for Section 1 on election campaigns, we will examine the role campaign financing and political parties play in electing candidates for public office. Section 2, Expanding Voting Rights, we will summarize the historical expansion of voting rights. Section 3, Influences on Voters, we will evaluate the factors that influence voters and non-voters. Section 1, Election Campaigns. Electing the President. Serious candidates for president begin organizing over a year before the election to compete in the spring primaries. After the nominating convention, the candidate runs an intensive campaign from early September until the November election. To win a presidential election, a candidate must receive a majority of the electoral votes. The candidate must decide on the kind of strategy most likely to achieve victory. As such, modern presidents really develop their campaign strategies around winning key select counties in various states that they feel will make a difference. For example, the state of California has been pretty solidly gone to the Democrats in recent years, and as such, we haven't seen very much campaigning here by Republicans or Democrats, particularly in the general election. Instead, they tend to focus their efforts more on what you would refer to as swing states, by focusing their campaigns on counties they think can ultimately make a difference for them and helping them to win those key swing states. And a swing state is a state that really is considered to be in play. It could go either way. So that definitely shapes the way in which campaigns are run. A strong organization headed by an experienced campaign manager is essential to a campaign. Television and internet are important tools for presidential candidates. Television conveys the candidate's image, while websites can be used to raise money and to inform the public about the candidate. Political action committees, or PACs. Running for office is very expensive. For example, presidential and congressional candidates spent a total of $3 billion in the 2002 elections. Now, of course, that was 13 years ago. In the time that has passed since, elections, each successive election is becoming more expensive. More and more money is spent, especially during presidential election years. In the 1970s, a new campaign financing system was set up based on public disclosure of spending, public funding of presidential elections, and limiting or prohibiting the contributions of certain groups. Created in 1974, the Federal Election Commission, or FEC, is an independent agency that administers federal election laws, keeps records of campaign contributions. The majority of campaign funding comes from private sources, including individual citizens, party organizations, corporations, and special interest groups. Political action committees, or PACs, are established by interest groups to support candidates, but they're limited in the donations that they can make. Connected PACs. Most of the 4,600 active registered PACs are connected PACs, established by businesses, labor unions, trade groups, or health organizations. These PACs receive and raise money from a restricted class, generally consisting of managers and shareholders in the case of a corporation, and members in the case of a union or other interest group. As of January 2009, there were 1,598 registered corporate PACs and 272 related to labor unions and 995 to trade organizations. Non-connected PACs. Groups with an ideological mission, single-issue groups, and members of Congress and other political leaders may form non-connected PACs. These organizations may accept funds from any individual, business PAC, or organization. As of January 2009, there were 1,594 non-connected PACs, the fastest growing category. And this brings us now to super PACs. Starting with the 2010 elections, we saw the rise of super PACs, which can raise unlimited sums from corporations, unions, and other groups, as well as individuals. The super PACs were made possible by the Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission decision by the Supreme Court. The groups can also mount the kind of direct attacks on candidates that were not allowed in the past. Super PACs are not allowed to coordinate directly with candidates or political parties, and they are required to disclose their donors. But this brings us to another type of organization, the 501c4. 501c4 organizations are not required to disclose their donors publicly. This aspect of the law has led to extensive use of the 501c4 provisions for organizations that are actively involved in lobbying and has become very controversial. In 2010, a bill called the Disclose Act was passed by the U.S. House of Representatives that addressed identification of donors to organizations involved in political advocacy. But the bill failed to pass in the Senate. In the summer of 2011, comedian Stephen Colbert brought attention to the issue of super PACs by forming his own and a 501c4. As of August 2011, 165,000 of his viewers had joined it. Now, what this in essence allows them to do is a company can create a 501c4. Their primary purpose has to be something kind of community related, not directly related to politics, but that's somewhat subjective. And what they can do is, because they do not have to disclose their donors, donors can give to this 501c4, and in turn, the 501c4 can make contributions to a super PAC. So what you might see is that a particular super PAC received money, and when it discloses its donors, from a 501c4, but you don't know who has contributed to that 501c4. So it basically allows groups or organizations donating money to try to influence elections to, in essence, launder the money and hide the true root of where it came from, which circumvents the intent of the law. Financing campaigns. Two methods are used to get around campaign spending limits. Soft money donations, which are contributions given directly to a political party for general purposes, such as voter registration drives and issue advocacy advertisements, which support an issue rather than a particular candidate. The Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, passed in 2002, bans soft money donations to national political parties, but its constitutionality remains in question. The FEC regulates campaigns online. For example, all campaign websites that cost $250 or more must be registered with the FEC. Section 2, Expanding Voting Rights. Early limitations on voting. Before the American Revolution, women and African Americans, white males who did not own property, and persons who were not members of dominant religious groups were excluded from voting. During the early 1800s, states gradually abolished property and religious requirements for voting, and by the mid-1800s, the nation had achieved universal white male suffrage, meaning that all men could vote, or all white men, rather, could vote. As far as women's suffrage, by 1914, women had won the right to vote in 11 states. The 19th Amendment, ratified after World War I, granted women in all states the right to vote. African American suffrage. Enslaved African Americans were not allowed to vote, and free African Americans could not vote or could vote only in a few states until 1870. The 15th Amendment, passed after the Civil War, granted the vote to African Americans in both state and national elections, but it did not result in full voting rights for African Americans. Southern states set up restrictive voting qualifications. Some southern states used literacy tests to disqualify African Americans from voting. Poll taxes, or money payments required before voting, and grandfather clauses, excusing white voters from paying the tax, were devices that were used to discourage African Americans from voting. The 24th Amendment banned poll taxes. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 and later voting rights laws brought the federal government directly into the electoral process in the states, ending official discrimination against African Americans and increasing their political strength and participation in government. In 2013, the Supreme Court overturned part of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, saying that times have changed. Many question whether or not this decision will lead to the disenfranchisement of minority voters. The 26th Amendment. This amendment lowered the voting age to 18 throughout the nation. The amendment helped to satisfy those young people who could be drafted into the military but could not vote. And this amendment was added during the midst of the Vietnam War, when many young soldiers were being drafted to go fight in the war, and yet they didn't have a vote. Influences on voters. Personal backgrounds of voters. Voters' ages may affect their views and determine their voting decisions. Education, religion, and racial or ethnic backgrounds affect voters' attitudes. But voters do not always vote in keeping with their backgrounds. Cross-pressured voters, those caught between conflicting elements in their lives, may vote based on the issues and candidates. Because the majority of American voters consider themselves either Republican or Democrat, most vote for their party's candidates. Not all party members, though, vote for all of their party's candidates. Some are strong party voters, meaning they vote very strictly for their party's candidates, and others are weak party voters, meaning they usually vote for their party's candidates, but not always. Independent voters, who have increased in numbers, do not belong to either major party but are an important element in presidential elections. Issues in election campaigns. Many current voters are better informed than past voters because they're better educated. Current issues have a greater impact on their personal lives, and television imparts information on issues. Still, most voters are not fully informed on campaign issues. The 1980 presidential election demonstrated the importance of issues. The high rate of inflation, the high cost of living, and the high rate of unemployment were issues debated by the candidates that clearly helped Reagan to win the election. The candidate's image. Americans want someone that they can trust as a national leader. Voters often select candidates for the image that they project. Propaganda. Political parties and candidates use ideas, information, and rumors to influence voters with propaganda techniques. Name-calling, testimonials, bandwagon, transfer, plain folks, and card stacking help them to win votes. The profile of regular voters. Regular voters have positive attitudes towards government and citizenship. Generally, regular voters have more education and a higher than average income. Middle-aged citizens have the highest voter turnout. Profile of non-voters. They may not meet citizenship, residency, and registration requirements. The percentage of voters among those who are eligible has declined.